Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Bryce Taish. I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at Ryan Companies. I am at our office headquarters here in Minneapolis, and it's really great to be here today, given how, like so many of us, I have been working quite differently these past 6 months. For me, that has meant working from home. I know that Groundbreak is a bit different this year, and many of us would greatly prefer to be together right now. I'm sorry that we can't be in the same room together in person, but wherever you are, I hope you are safe and comfortable and ready to spend the next 30 minutes with me to talk about allyship. We'll be talking about a few different things over the next 30 minutes. What exactly is allyship? What do allies do and what do they not do? And what are some of the things that we can each do as allies? And we'll leave some time at the end for some questions as well. Before we get started, just a little bit about me. As I mentioned, I live in Minneapolis, but I've lived all across North America, from Los Angeles to Chicago to Philadelphia, Canada, Halifax, Nova Scotia. In the middle of the screen, that's my three sons. This picture was taken just this past weekend. That's Elias, Oscar, and Xavier. And next to them is a picture of me and my husband. We'll be together 25 years next spring. That's us voting last week. And the last picture rounding out our family are our two dogs, Boomer and Sheldon. A lot of the work that I do around diversity and inclusion is to make sure that my family, my kids in particular, are able to live in a better world, a more just, equal world. I also wanted to share just really briefly a little bit more about Ryan Companies as well. I've been with the company for a year and a half, and if you're not familiar with us, we are a national commercial real estate services company. We help our customers from project conception to completion, whether that's design, whether that's construction, development, management. One of the things I love about Ryan is we're a very values-driven organization. We are deeply involved in our communities, and we deeply care about our customers and our employees. I am one of 1,500 employees here, and I'm really grateful to be part of the Ryan family. I talked a little bit about how this last 6 months has been really different for all of us. Here's a few of my coworkers. These pictures were all taken just over the past couple of months, and I know that for many of us, our lives have changed a lot. And for many of us, it's been difficult. We've struggled, we've worried about our loved ones' health, we've stressed out over childcare or how to manage online school. But I think if there's been a silver lining as well, we've also come together and come to know each other better, to care for each other more deeply, and to meet each other's families, and whether those are kids or four-legged friends, to really be able to make more authentic connections. And in my view, that's been one of the silver linings of this pandemic. And I think that ties into the concept of allyship as well, because so much of being an ally is really seeking to understand others and their experiences. So let's go ahead and talk about allyship. Being an ally means different things to different people. And the definition that we're going to talk about right now is just one definition. It's a definition I like. There's many others. And just like each of us is different in our own ways, we each might approach this concept of allyship differently as well. But I like thinking about allyship as a lifelong journey of learning and taking actions to advance the equality of people who belong in a marginalized group that we ourselves are not part of. And I think really key to this concept is that allies, to be an ally, you have to take action. It's not enough for you to say you're an ally. You need to actually show up and show to others through action that you are doing things to support other people. And I should also just say that although I have been working at being an ally for many years, decades, it's still something I'm working at, and I'll be working at for the rest of my life. We each have our journeys. I'm just sharing mine. There is no point where you get a certificate or a degree to say, yes, I am an ally. You can't self-declare yourself as that. It's really based upon your actions that others perceive. we can each be an ally to someone else. And at Ryan, since the murder of George Floyd in May, we've been really focused on allyship for people of color and specifically to Black people. But I think it's also important to know that we can be an ally for lots of different groups of people. And often those groups are marginalized in some way, they're vulnerable, they're oppressed, they're at risk of facing discrimination. And you can see on your screen here just some of the different groups that we can be allies to. I think it's also important to know that we are all very complex. Our identities intersect, and no one identity alone defines who we are. So it's quite possible, as you're looking at the list of groups on the screen, that you might identify with more than one of them. And I think what's wonderful about the concept of allyship is no matter who we are, there are points where we can do more to stand up and speak up for others. So let's talk about 4 things that allies can do. They are knowing your privilege. They are listening more than you talk. The third one is about learning, a continuous lifelong journey of learning. And then the last one is how do we speak up and stand up? And I'll be talking about each of these. And then I'll be giving some examples about what you can do personally and what your organization can do as well. So let's start with this concept of privilege. I know even the word privilege can tend to make some of us uncomfortable. So let's go ahead and define it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. Privilege is a set of unearned benefits that are given to people who fit into a specific social group. Privilege does not mean that you didn't work hard or that you didn't struggle for what you have. Privilege simply means that there are some things that you don't have to think about or won't experience just because of who you are. And I'll be the first to admit that for many years, I denied that privilege was real. I would hear the word and I would get defensive. And my thinking was, well, you know what? I grew up with very little money, so I can't be privileged. I worked multiple jobs to pay my way through college. I had to work really hard for what I have. And when I heard the concept privilege, I viewed it as almost like this personal attack. And it took me time to really learn more about what privilege is and what it isn't, and then to realize, okay, I do have privilege, so how can I use that in a positive way? That's something that we've been talking a lot about at Ryan Companies. And there are lots of different kinds of privilege, certainly. We've been focusing on white privilege, but just like we can be allies for lots of different kinds of people, there's all kinds of different privilege as well related to race or ethnicity or gender or disability or sexual orientation. There's lots of different kinds of privilege as well. So I'd like to share a few examples of privilege, and then I'll share a few that are at play within my own family as well. So if you can arrange to be in the company of people of your own race most of the time, that would be an example of privilege. If you can turn on your television or open up a magazine or go online and see people of your own race widely represented, that is an example of privilege. If you don't have to educate your children that others might dislike them or try to hurt them because of their race, that would be an example of privilege. If you're never asked to speak for all the people in your racial group, that would be another example of privilege. If you don't have to worry about how others are going to treat your family because of their race, that would be an example of privilege. So those are 5 examples. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of other examples that we could go through, but I thought what I could do is share some examples within my own family. And I showed a picture earlier of my 3 boys, and I thought we could talk a little bit about their experiences and how, as their father, I often have to use my own privilege to be their advocate. So that's Xavier in the back. He is African Nova Scotian. He is 15. And we've had the talk many times about how he needs to behave around police and how the rules are different for him because of the color of his skin. And this is the exact same discussion that every parent of any Black child in America has. If you've never had to think about giving this talk to your children, that would be an example of privilege. When Xavier was younger, we had to work extra hard to find books or movies or TV shows that had Black characters, much less Black protagonists or heroes, so that he could see himself in the stories that we were reading or watching. Having to do that extra work was not always easy, and not having to do that work would be a form of privilege, because in the United States, a lot of those stories are based around white characters. Xavier often has to find a way to fit himself into a world that is largely white. Every single day, he is constantly reminded of his race and is often the only person of color or one of the only people of color in any space, whether that's at school, whether that's in our community. And if you rarely have to think about your race, that would be an example of privilege again. In the middle of the picture is my son, Oscar. He's 17. He is Guatemalan. He is fluent in Spanish and Mam, which is a Mayan language, and he's still learning English. Privilege for him is being able to easily communicate with those around you. That's not something that he can do. He lacks that privilege. You or I can probably go almost anywhere and be able to speak with anyone, knowing that we're going to be able to understand each other. That in itself is an example of privilege, not requiring a translator to communicate with others that you might interact with on a day-to-day basis. Elias in the front, his brain, like Xavier's, is wired a bit differently than many other people. He needs accommodations to help learn and to remain focused in class. And not having to think about this kind of help is another form of privilege. And I think it's also important to know that so many elements of our identity are not visible to others. And so the only way we can know what additional assistance that someone might need or support that someone might need sometimes is it requires asking and really getting to know someone. I think what's key here is to remember that we all have some privilege, regardless of how we identify. And we often don't think about it on a day-to-day basis, but we can use that in a very positive way to help others. For us to be an ally to someone from another group, we have to really understand our own privilege, our own power, our own influence. And that's one of the key things for us to be able to do as allies. I'd also like to talk about how we can each do more to listen to each other. And listening is a really good place to start. It's not easy to be an active listener. I need to practice to do it all the time. It's not easy for me to always put aside my own thoughts and ideas and judgments and to listen from a place of true curiosity and empathy and a desire to truly understand someone else. I often am ready to say whatever's next on my mind as opposed to really be in that moment and listen to what someone else is trying to tell me. And in the world of diversity and inclusion, we often talk about building psychological safety, where everyone feels safe expressing their ideas or their concerns, and they know that there's not going to be any risk doing so. They're not going to be called out. There's not going to be any kind of retribution. But the truth is, if you are in a marginalized group at work, chances are pretty good that you're not feeling that sense of safety, at least not every day. Chances are that you've never been even asked to share your concerns, and if you do, that it might not be safe to do so. And at Ryan, we have been trying to be better listeners these past few months. We've created lots of spaces for us to sit down with someone and truly listen to someone whose experiences are different than our own. Whether those are one-on-one interactions, we've been having a lot of listening circles, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, small group discussions where we truly do seek to listen to people more than share our own experiences. holding focus groups, holding town halls, and conducting surveys and pulse checks as well. The idea is, how can we find lots of different ways to listen to each other, here specifically at work, to better understand what it's like to be someone else. And one thing that I find difficult sometimes, especially as a member of a majority group, and at Ryan and within our industry, white men do form the majority group, is how to use my voice without speaking over other people that I'm trying to support. How do I speak up but not speak over people? How do I not dominate the discussion? How do I listen, especially when people have criticism that you know, I might have said something insensitive or inappropriate or hurtful, completely inadvertently, but how do I really listen to that as well and take that feedback with grace and humility? So this concept of listening is really, really important. You can't be an ally if you don't seek to listen to others from other groups. And associated with listening is learning. And learning is something I think that we all love to do. Many of us approach things from a growth mindset. We enjoy learning. Learning to be an ally, though, is not easy. It requires us to think about the world differently, to be open to changing our mind and to sometimes unlearning things. Learning is also something that we have to own. It's not anyone else's responsibility to help us learn. And sometimes we don't know where to go, where to start. It is our own job to teach us. We could certainly ask questions of others, but we should also expect that some others might not want to engage in discussion if we haven't done our own work ourselves. And that learning, it's everything from learning about ourselves, our own identities, our own cultures, our own biases, which all of us have. It's learning about others' experiences and what makes them who they are, their histories, their struggles. And it's also then learning how we benefit from systems that others do not benefit from, and to understand the history of oppression and injustice in the United States, how we participate in those systems, so that we can then work together with others to change those systems. And those could be societal systems, they could be organizational systems, they could be within our own communities, but quite often systems were designed to help some people while leaving other people out. I believe that the learning piece is easier said than done. At Ryan, we've been doing a whole lot in this area. We've been doing racial equity learning challenges. We've been bringing in guest speakers. We've been reading a lot. We've been listening to podcasts. We've been doing a lot of research. We've been encouraging each other to reach out to people in our broader networks to, again, listen and learn, and then to share with others what we're learning, to not only share within Ryan, within our workplace, but to share within our broader networks as well, within our neighborhoods, within our families, within our places of worship, or other places where we might meet friends, colleagues, neighbors. And throughout all of this, as we're learning, we're also learning that we don't have to understand everything, that some of this is very complex, and we might not know exactly what it's like to live in someone else's shoes, but we can still learn to be respectful of everyone and to try to understand what it's like to be someone else. So we've talked about knowing your privilege. We have talked about the importance of listening. We've talked about how you also must commit to learning throughout your entire life about others. And then the fourth area that I'd like to focus on is all around standing up and speaking up. And at the very beginning, I talked about how allyship requires action. And that's where this part comes in as well. Allies speak up and they stand up when they see or hear something that's wrong, whether that's at work, whether that's at school, or at a party, at soccer practice, at Costco. Wherever you see something that seems wrong, you need to speak up and stand up. And that requires risk. It is scary. I have failed at it many times. It's not easy. You're going to mess it up sometimes. But we each do need to intervene when racism or injustice, however small it might be, whenever we witness that. And we can do so in a way that is really respectful and attempting to educate someone else, assuming that they have good intent, about how their words or actions might be hurting someone else. This is where we actually get to use our privilege. And there's lots and lots of different ways that we can do this. At work, I think a very simple way you can do that is acknowledging that the past few months have been very difficult for all of us, and particularly for our Black colleagues and our colleagues of color who are being disproportionately affected by COVID and who are also traumatized almost on a daily basis by the events that are taking place. How often are you reaching out to your colleagues and asking how they are and if there's something that they need, knowing that you care about them and you're seeking to support them? That in itself is an example of speaking up. Other things that you can do at work is to have discussions with your own leadership and to challenge the status quo, to ask, why does your board look a certain way? Why does your C-suite look a certain way? Have you talked about these things with your leadership? If you are a manager and your team is made up mostly of people who look like you and think like you, what can you do to change that? Have you talked with your peers? Have you talked with your recruiter to see how you can bring more diversity to your team? Have you explored your network to identify how much diversity is there? If you're in a meeting, do you look around and see who's at the table and ask why others are not at the table? And how do you bring more seats to the table? How do you, regardless of what your role might be or your title might be or your tenure might be, how do you bring these types of things to other people's attention to stress that it's important to you and it should be important to them as well? If your company has employee resource groups, and many don't, right now we only have one. We only have a women's employee resource group. We're in the process of forming at least 5 others between now and the end of the year. Employee resource groups are great ways for people to connect and come together and share their experiences and help attract and retain diverse community members. If you have employee resource groups, however you identify, do you attend some of those meetings? And if you don't have them, how can you help develop one? So those are a few things that you can do at work. I'll also just talk about a few things that you should not do as an ally, and I have done all of these things and been called out for all of them. As I mentioned before, you should not expect to be taught. Your learning is your learning. You should not make things about you. When you are an ally, you are joining people who have been fighting for equality and justice their entire lives, and quite often for many generations. And so we should not come in and act like we have all the answers. And we also should not assume we are an ally. As I mentioned, we can strive to work towards being an ally, but that does not necessarily mean we are being one. And when we make mistakes, which I do daily, it's all about what we do with that. How do we apologize in a sincere way? How do we commit to not committing that or to repeating that mistake? And how do we keep practicing so that we do better next time? Allyship is not a part-time job. It's something that we need to do consistently every single minute of every single hour of every single day. So it is natural that you are going to make mistakes sometime. In our last couple minutes, I'll just share that at Ryan, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, just blocks from our headquarters where I sit right now. Right on the screen right now are a few pictures of the George Floyd Memorial that actually our CEO, Brian Murray, took. And since Mr. Floyd's murder, we have given permission to all of our employees to talk about systemic racism, to talk about police brutality, to talk about the effects that violence of any kind have on our colleagues and our customers and people within our communities. And these are not things that we had been talking about at work before. To help with some of these discussions, we've had a number of sessions that we call pause, listen, and learn sessions. We've had these every 2 weeks in at least one of our offices, and we have 16 locations across the country. And we bring in, whether they're community partners or whether they're Ryan employees, we bring in people to listen and to learn from them. On the screen here, we have Tawana Black. She's the CEO of the Center for Economic Inclusion here in the Twin Cities. We also have Dr. Uhuru Williams, who leads what's called the Racial Justice Initiative here. He guided our senior leadership team through a number of hours of learning around the African-American experience in the United States. I also put a picture of Steve Jordan, who's a member of the Vikings Ring of Honor. He's also a Ryan colleague here on our diversity and inclusion team, and he has talked about his experiences with racism over the course of his life. We have talked about covenants, we've talked about redlining, we've had police chiefs come in and talk with us, we've had members of Congress come in and talk with us. We've talked about Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter and what those each mean, the Confederate flag, statues. We're continuing to talk, and these conversations are not always easy. They're often uncomfortable, but we believe that having the conversation is important. And we might not always agree on everything, but we are committed to trying to understand different points of view and different experiences. I also put a picture of our Ryan Pledge on the screen here, and this was something that our CEO wrote a year ago, and it's a form of allyship as well. It gets to that whole concept of speaking up and standing up as well. Anytime we're at work and we hear something that doesn't sound right, we call someone out on that. We tell them to stop. We tell them to knock it off. We don't allow ourselves to make assumptions about other people based on their gender or race or any other form of their identity. It's part of our code, and it's something that each Ryan employee is encouraged to sign off on and to practice on a daily basis. I'll close by just sharing something else that we're doing at Ryan. This is an offshoot of our Diversity and Inclusion Council. I think it was about 5-6 weeks ago, we formed a racial equity task force made up of employees from across the organization, all of our regions and all of our functions. And we are looking at a set of recommendations that we'll be making to our executive leadership team sometime in October. There are 5 areas of focus that you can see on your screen. One is, what can we do more or differently around education and training, specifically around racial equity and social justice? How can we set more ambitious goals to increase the representation of people of color at Ryan? What practices do we need to change to retain and recruit and promote people of color here? How can we do a better job of tying our stewardship activities, our volunteering, and our philanthropy around racial equity and social justice? What are the business practices that we should put in place to further help minority businesses? And then lastly, how should we change our focus or add to our focus to help the communities that we're in, to help advance people of color and other minorities, whether that's where they're working, where they're living, where they're going to school? We don't have all the answers yet, but we have been meeting for a number of weeks, and we are committed to making change. And at some point, perhaps in the future, we can share some of what we are going to be doing to make sure that we are part of the solution. That is part of allyship. It's around making changes as you're able to make them. Again, whoever you are, whatever your role might be, we're all able to do that. And so just to recap, the 4 things that allies could and should do: relate to knowing your privilege, relate to listening more than you talk, committing to lifelong learning, and knowing when to speak up and to stand up. I really appreciate your time today. I would love to hear what you are doing within your own organizations or personally as allies as well. Again, as I said right at the beginning, we each treat allyship a little bit differently. We do have some time for questions, so we'll open it up there. And please, if you have any ideas that you'd like to share with me after today, my email is on the screen. You can connect with me via LinkedIn as well, or I can provide my contact information. It means a lot that you spent time with me today. Thank you so much.